A new frame. Oops, sorry. Okay. Um, First, it provides a new framework, I think, for thinking about recovery as a lived experience that focuses on the building of assets and capacity for overcoming problems. The recovery field began to take root in the decade between 2000 and 2010, but the reaction to notions of recovery from addiction from the researchers and addiction researchers was that the term was sort of vague and couldn't be adequately measured. Certainly, treatment has always talked about recovery, but the emphasis seemed to be on the treatment side and less interest or less conceptualization of what recovery really looked like and really how to measure it. So what the concept of recovery capital has done is to help operationalize the concept of recovery and identify some of the components of recovery. It speaks to the importance of internal dimensions of well-being, as well as to external factors that can promote well-being. From this perspective, it's a way of understanding the relationship between personal agency and social structure. I think it's also afforded the opportunity to track or to monitor the development of factors that lead to recovery through various assessments. Recovery capital can now be quantified and measured, and I'll say a little bit more about this later in my talk. Now, I think recovery capital has really come a long way from its rather humble beginnings in Denver, Colorado in 1999 to become really kind of a global movement that has contributed to transforming how we understand the process by which people overcome the various struggles that they might have experienced related to substance abuse, mental health, gambling, eating disorders, etc. It's evolved in ways that my collaborator, William Cloud, who's still in Denver, he's now retired from the University of Denver, it developed in ways he and I could not have imagined back then. As I look over the landscape of its growth internationally, I think the future possibilities for continued expansion offer exciting opportunities for strengthening the recovery movement. For instance, how might systems of care look if a recovery paradigm became a central focus of attention? How would social policies be transformed if there was a focus on building the capacities for individuals to overcome the assorted challenges that they face? What role might technological changes related to generative AI play in building recovery capital? I think these and others really are exciting possibilities to explore. I'd like to talk with you today about the origins of the idea of recovery capital and its expansion. However, it's important to recognize that that change oftentimes comes slowly and new ideas rarely evolve in a linear fashion. I want you to think for a moment about a global health crisis that contributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of people annually, and that the accepted form of treatment was having limited results. I'm not talking about COVID or even addiction. I'm actually talking about penicillin. In 1928, when Alexander Fleming discovered, quite by accident, that a common mold known as penicillium could effectively kill deadly bacteria, a discovery that led to the first antibiotic medicine. His idea was initially rejected by the scientific and medical communities. Scientists and medical doctors rejected the idea that a substance like mold could cure infection, and that the cure could take place internally as opposed to directly applied to the infected part of the body. They considered his results unscientific and his findings due to chance. It would take several more years of work by others, as well as a worldwide event like World War II, to overcome the resistance by the medical and scientific establishment to produce a change on a global scale. We can think of various examples of new ideas that were originally rejected that eventually, after many years, became accepted and legitimate practices. This is by no means to suggest that recovery capital can compare to the global impact that penicillin had on humanity. After all, Fleming and his associates went on to receive the Nobel Prize in 1945. But as a novel idea, recovery capital has followed a very similar life cycle. The development and expansion of the theory of recovery capital has been influenced by many factors. For instance, it was well known, even back in the 60s, from Charles Winnick's classic study in the early 60s, that many people overcame addiction without treatment. That literature had continued to develop over the years, actually was kind of one of the things that stimulated us to do our work. There are also developments in community-based models of recovery that became more prominent after 2000. I'm speaking here, and I'll say a little bit more about this, but I'm speaking here really about the whole movement of recovery-oriented systems of care. And there are also numerous critiques and commentaries on the disease concept of addiction that sought to broaden the view of addiction and recovery beyond a kind of a medicalized approach. So it was really in 1989 that William Cloud and I met at the University of Denver. We were both much younger then, when we came to the University of Denver to begin our careers in higher education. We were really brought together by a book. We were brought together by Stanton Peele's very important book in 1989, The Diseasing of America, where Stanton goes on to critique the disease concept of addiction. William was browsing through the bookstore at the University of Denver and discovered that both he and I had assigned this book for our courses. His course was in social work, my course was in sociology. And William returned to his office immediately, contacted me. Our initial investigations and grants were more focused on studies and prevention, including work on the relationship between historical trauma and addiction within indigenous communities, and its implications for prevention. However, these investigations also gave us the opportunity to discuss the limitations of the disease concept more generally. We both recognized that formal treatment had limited effects and that there was limited availability of treatment services within the US as well as around the globe. We further were familiar with the evidence of natural recovery, and that many people overcame addiction without the benefit of treatment. It was really this that led us to undertake the investigation of natural recovery for the purposes of developing a broader theoretical understanding of this common pathway out of addiction. So our studies really began as a qualitative study, a rather small study. Our study really began in 1994. We began collecting data. And because we were conducting research on a hidden population, it took considerable time to collect our data. There wasn't an easy method to locate individuals who had experienced a natural recovery. They didn't show up, they weren't in treatment, so they didn't show up on treatment rosters. They were not in self-help groups, so we couldn't find them there. So we had to use advertisements and networks and snowball sampling techniques to produce a reasonable sample. And we ended up with a study of 46 individuals from the Denver area. We examined the kind of micro and macro components of their recovery experience. So during our extensive interviews with our subjects, we focused on the recovery narratives of our respondents. And we analyzed those narratives to find the common patterns and strategies that they used. So in a very real way, because we listened deeply to the voices of individuals dealing with addictive problems and didn't simply see their experiences through a medicalized gaze, we were really able to identify the elements in their lives that we later defined as recovery capital. Now, we initially decided to focus on the process by which our subjects overcame their addictions. It was important for us, I think, to really kind of unravel this, because their success couldn't simply be attributed to an outcome of treatment, since they were not in treatment. So we first noted that all of our respondents experienced a turning point after also experiencing various strains and various problems: family problems, legal problems, health problems, relationship problems, employment problems. But all of them experienced a turning point during their addictions that really served as a spark that lit the recovery fire. Now, these turning points were highly differentiated and individualized. You can never predict what a turning point would be because it was related to a person's biography. Each individual had a slightly different turning, but they all had turning points. However, we realized also that experiencing a turning point, in other words, stopping addictive use, is not the same thing as maintaining recovery. So this has been pointed out frequently in the recovery literature, the difference between a turning point and maintenance. So we thought to identify the additional steps along their road to recovery, including their cessation strategies. And what we found that individuals were engaged, they engaged themselves in various activities. They were very active in developing other pursuits. They became deeply involved in, say, religion, or deeply involved in education or physical activities, or increased civic engagement, volunteerism, book clubs, social clubs, etc. These were the most common. They also used the power of relationships: sober friends, family, associates, past and present. Many were able to maintain relationships. Many were able to develop new relationships, but relationships, we saw, were critically important to their recovery. And also a cessation strategy was that they avoided person, places, and things associated with heavy substance use and misuse. In fact, that's how several of them actually ended up in Denver, because they had moved from Denver to get out of their location. So in a sense, it was a geographical change that to help them overcome addiction. There was also the realization, I think the final stage was the realization of the rewards associated with sobriety. Many of them talked about finding new pleasures and satisfaction in sobriety, and began to realize the incompatibility between heavy substance abuse and their well-being, and the well-being they were experiencing from their new pursuits and meaningful relationships. So we also focused on what this all meant in terms of their identity. We really looked at the radical reorganization of personal meaning, and that aided them in developing a stake in conventional life and to establish a collaborative relationship with the world. Part of this new identity was geared towards making sense of their addiction, not as a flaw or a failure, but a sense of empowerment. Most of our subjects didn't see themselves as lifelong addicts, nor did they perceive themselves as flawed in some ways. Many embraced their past as part of their own personal growth. And I think sometimes, unintentionally, of course, I think treatment, and maybe society more generally, teaches people struggling with addiction that they are flawed and powerless. Our subjects' new identities contrasted greatly with the standard disease model identities. So while we knew that there were personal factors that were important in the recovery process, we also knew that there was a structural dimension to the story as well. So our respondents, just because of the nature, we never claimed it's a representative sample, it's a snowball sample. So our respondents were pretty much socially advantaged. Most of them had educational credentials. Many of them had graduated from college. They had professional employment. They had lived with a certain degree of stability in their lives. But during the time, I was also exploring the concept of social capital that sociologists, economists, and political scientists were using to discuss various dimensions of social life. And I was struck by the definition of social capital as developed by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. he defined social capital as the sum of the resources, actual or virtual, that accrued to an individual or group by possessing a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition. The concept had been applied to many aspects of social life, such as occupational mobility, civic culture, business transactions, and volunteering, as well as a way of understanding class structure and inequality more generally, but it hadn't been applied to understanding how people overcome personal problems like addiction. The first time we presented on the subject was at a Kettle Brewing Society conference held in Switzerland in the early part of 1999. It's a very small conference of addiction researchers that we had the opportunity to interact with for about a week, really. It was a week-long conference. However, making the connection between recovery capital and social capital was important in developing our construct. So that was really the first notion of capital that we had used. So as a way to capture the broader structural dimension of recovery, we use the concept of social capital. And in our book that we published in '99, we began to see three aspects of social capital that were critically important. First, all of our individuals experienced a period of stability. Most subjects experienced periods of stable employment, financial security, and they had minimal exposure to criminal justice system or criminal activities for that matter. A second aspect of social capital was feeling the sense of obligation to others, parents, friends, sort of just generalized others in many ways that felt that they owed something to. That sense of obligation can be a potent form of social capital. And then also they were able to maintain relationships. The subjects were able to maintain supportive networks with family, friends, associates, despite their substance misuse, which aided in their recovery. So up to this point in our analysis, we had conceptualized recovery capital as a process of personal transformation and the accumulation of assets. We had focused on the desistance through turning points. We focused on the aspects of maintenance that we saw in our respondents' lives, the issues of connectedness, civic engagement, the development of new identities, and the sense of empowerment. And we also saw the importance of social capital, the benefits that accrue to an individual by virtue of the possession of a network of individuals in their lives. Now, had we ended our study here, I think we would have failed to have developed a multidimensional theory of recovery. We continued analyzing our data and realized that our analysis was incomplete. We began to see more and more complexity in the narratives of our subjects. There was evidence of various dimensions of capital, including human capital, physical capital, and cultural capital. Again, concepts that were being employed in the social sciences. However, there was not a unified concept in the literature on addiction that captured the multidimensionality that we were seeing. So this was the eureka moment, really, as William and I continued to probe our data, to write up our work. It really just happened in the context of a conversation about our data. In fact, this is a quote from William when he was interviewed at one point, that the idea of recovery capital came not as in the context of a high-level professional conference, but during a conversation we were having during a Saturday afternoon barbecue. I guess the hamburgers were really good. That's when we shifted from the idea of social capital to the clearer concept of recovery capital. And I think we said it's recovery capital, as we knew it was, social, human, physical, cultural, and we just hit upon the idea of recovery capital. And I think the next comment was pass the mustard. So what is recovery capital? As we defined it in our book, Coming Clean, in 1999. Well, we defined it as the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to sustain, to initiate and sustain recovery. It embodies the attributes available to individuals that can promote the capacity to overcome life challenges, including those associated with addiction. It really is an ecosystem. We started seeing this less as a series of disconnected events and began to see it more as an organized system of micro level and macro level components that promote health, wellness, and the capacity to overcome addiction. So what are the four components that we identified of recovery capital? Well, I talked a little bit already about social capital, and we saw the importance of networks. We saw the importance of community engagement and the importance of peer influences, friends in their lives, acquaintances in their lives as they were experiencing their troubles as well as moving into recovery. But we also noted that human capital factors were very important, the skills and resources that people had, personal skills such as developing coping strategies, emotional intelligence and regulation, critical thinking, the ability to problem solve. All these aspects of human capital were very important. Also, educational resources, the attainment of knowledge, the access to educational opportunities, workshops, skill building programs, all of this enriched their human capital. And of course, the more traditional aspects of human capital, of employment background and job-related abilities. We also noted the importance of physical capital, or the health and wellness in recovery. So access to a balanced diet and proper nutrition, many people spoke about, and it contributed to their recovery. The ability to engage in physical activities and exercise routines that help promote health and wellness. And the more tangible resources such as stable housing, transportation, healthcare, income, access to technology, all these were critically important. And then finally, the cultural capital aspect of it, the beliefs and values that supported recovery. Cultural norms and practices, the various practices and rituals that promote recovery, normative values, promoting sobriety, reliance on community assets, various cultural traditions, exploring the traditions and family traditions and cultural traditions that aligned with recovery. Many of our respondents spoke about the importance of these values. Many of them found strength in religious and spiritual beliefs. Much of it was non-denominational. Not necessarily. Some did affiliate with religions, churches, but for many it was non-denominational. So what really then is recovery capital? So as we conceptualize that recovery capital encompasses both internal and external attributes available to individuals and promotes the capacity to overcome life challenges. It's a dynamic quality that operates on a continuum of positive and negative recovery capital that impacts the recovery experience. And that it relates to social structure, that the opportunities to build and activate recovery capital are shaped in large part by the social structures within which an individual is embedded. So this allows us to think about different theoretical propositions. First, recovery capital is a learning process of personal change and transformation. People learn how to recover. Secondly, the learning process of change takes place within social interaction. When we were doing our work on natural recovery, we were very careful not to say it was self-recovery, because no recovery, wherever it happens, takes place outside of social interaction. It's embedded within social interaction. The social interaction related to the change involves the accumulation of recovery capital. And that a person's recovery capital is defined, as I said a moment ago, by the total sum of internal and external resources that promote their capacity to change. The internal and external resources associated with recovery capital exist at the personal, social, and community levels across those four distinct dimensions. And I think the understand, the realization or the appreciation of it. It occurs at multiple levels: the personal level, the social level, the community level. This is part of the ecosystem of recovery. Recovery capital possesses a dynamic quality that has differential trajectories. One of the challenges, I think, of the idea of recovery capital is that it's not globally specific. So while people go through these exchanges, the importance of social capital and human capital, et cetera, it looks different for different individuals, differential trajectories. Positive recovery capital can be facilitated through participation in pro-social networks, communities, institutions. And it's important to realize that access to recovery capital is not equally distributed throughout society. Some people may have more access to it than others. And then finally, recovery is facilitated when there is an excess of positive recovery capital, those factors that promote and facilitate recovery, relative to negative social capital or negative recovery capital, or those factors that diminish or interfere with the capacity for recovery. Now, the initial reception to the concept of recovery capital was not immediately favorable when we published our book in 1999, which was the first time that we had coined or we had used the term recovery capital in our publications. The concept was not seen as being scientifically validated and was a departure from a focus on treatment and treatment outcomes. In fact, William and I tried a few times to acquire funding, from federal funding through National Institutes of Health, to continue to work in this area, to validate it, and to develop an instrument. But we kept getting rejected because we kept being told this was not a valid concept. And I think we can think of 4 different phases of the recovery capital movement, because it really, the landscape looks a lot different now than it certainly did when we initially published our work in '99. So first was the developmental phase, which was really what I just mentioned. We developed it and published it in 1999 and met with initial rejection by many, in part due to the focus on the relatively vague concept of recovery at the time. But it moved through a legitimation process. Several years after we had published our work, it became adopted in the emerging recovery-oriented systems of care movement after 2000. Most notably, I point to the work of William White. Some of you might be familiar with Bill's work. Bill is now retired, but Bill is a well-respected leader in the addiction field and was an early promoter of the recovery-oriented systems of care movement and spoke frequently about it and adopted the concept of recovery capital in his presentations and his research. And he was a kind of a scientist practitioner. So he conducted research, but he was not at a university. He was more of a practitioner and a kind of a change agent. Bill was really the first person to embrace the concept and explore its significance in the delivery of services. This really became the impetus for the emergence of the science of recovery capital that was led in large measure by the work also of people like David Best, Andre Laudet, and John Kelly at Harvard, all of whom had connections back to Bill White. So you begin to see the importance of networks here. And so from a sociological point of view, Bill provided the bridging capital needed to move the concept into the network of recovery-oriented systems of care. I think we can think also about the expansion phase, that beginning in around 2010 and continuing, the science of recovery capital has grown significantly. And in the latter part of the decade, it began to be applied to several areas, including gambling, mental health, suicide ideation, and eating disorders. And finally, I think we can think about an institutional phase, which is really kind of post-2015, where we began to see the development of recovery capital conferences, and one in particular, the Recovery Capital Conference in Canada, which started in 2017, which brought together academics, practitioners, recovering people, health ministers mostly from Canada in 2017 to explore the implications and research and of recovery capital. And the next conference is actually taking place next month in Calgary. There was also the adoption of recovery capital terminology in addiction agencies, including NIH, who had originally turned down our efforts to expand the concept. And we began to see more and more the emerging presence of recovery capital on various websites. There are currently over 160,000 websites now that I can find that make reference to recovery capital. So it really has expanded. And so what are some of the implications of recovery capital? Well, I think one of the implications that it has shifted the concept, helped to shift the concept really, to a recovery-oriented systems of care model in addressing addiction. And so the recovery-oriented systems of care is a coordinated network of community-based services and supports that is person-centered and builds on the strengths and resiliencies of individuals, families, and communities to achieve improved health, wellness, and quality of life for those with or at risk for substance use problems. This comes out of SAMHSA in 2010. I think it's helped broaden our understanding of recovery. The recognition that recovery capital's multidimensional nature and the existence of various pathways out of addiction has broadened our understanding of recovery and paved the way for a more inclusive and comprehensive approach. The current NIH definition of recovery actually doesn't really speak about the ending of use. It's much more vague, but it also incorporates some of the aspects of recovery capital. They define it as the cessation of heavy drinking and the improvement in well-being. And this is what recovery capital is all about, is really improvements in well-being. So the concept, I think, has helped capture the full spectrum of recovery determinants within a resource-based ecological framework. And then I think there are lots of policy implications that emerge from the recovery capital framework. One of the things, I won't spend too much time on this because we're running a bit late here, but I think one of the things that has been aided, has aided the movement really has been the development of various measurements and assessments of recovery capital. And these are three of the most common ones that have been developed going back really to 2013. So the Recovery Capital Questionnaire developed, and they were all developed from the basic model that we had written about in recovery capital. Perhaps the most common one has been the ARC, the Assessment of Recovery Capital. This was developed with David Best and Bill White. And again, I encourage you to look at their research, particularly David's work. David is a leading scholar in the area of recovery capital. And actually, David is editing a book, the first book really on recovery capital that hopefully will be coming out this year. So they created the ARC in 2013 with 50 items, and then they redid it in 2017 that created to kind of with 10 items. And you can find these measurements, these instruments in the research. I've been involved in efforts at the University of Buffalo to develop a multidimensional scale to measure recovery capital. This measurement not only assesses the four components of recovery capital, but also seeks to assess the factors that facilitate or act as barriers to the accumulation of recovery capital. And so this was a project that we initiated at the University of Buffalo. A team of individuals received NIH funding to develop this. And again, the article is here that you can see. It was published recently, just last year, in Drug and Alcohol Dependence. It's called the MERC. This is the Multidimensional Inventory of Recovery Capital. And it's really a tool, as I said, to measure the various dimensions of recovery capital. And we developed it in a somewhat different way. First, we developed it by using individuals who are in recovery. We really wanted to get the perspective of individuals in recovery. I don't think the other instruments utilized individuals in recovery. I think they developed the concept in association with our concept. They developed the items around the concept, but we wanted to validate it with individuals who themselves were in recovery, as well as individual service providers. So we developed a bank of questions and then ran them by these individuals in order to get a kind of a first take of their validity. The second phase was that we created a very large sample of 497 individuals who completed a draft version of the MERC and other measures in order to get that concurrent validity. And based on the sociometric analysis of the data, we made some changes. Now, it's a lot easier to develop samples these days than it was when we were doing it back in '99, because you can find individuals on the internet who sign up to take surveys. And so this is how we did this. And our third phase was that we took our refined instrument, and gave it to another 482 individuals who completed the MERC. The team cut out a few more items and kind of refined the measure to a 28-item survey. And you can find this at this website, and I'll make this website available to Verna so that you can access it. You can find the survey, you can find the instrument, there's a downloadable copy, instructions about how to use it, how to score it. So that might be a useful website for you. I guess in conclusion, the concept of recovery capital started out really as a theoretical construct to explain the recovery experiences of 46 individuals in Denver, Colorado. It really has grown into a movement of people that have used the concept to better define and understand recovery, who have employed it as the foundation of recovery programs, who have developed conferences to educate professionals, academics, health ministers, and treatment personnel, who have used it to chart their own recovery journey, and have applied it to a variety of other problems across several countries. I think we've learned much over the years in relation to recovery capital, the importance of it to substance abuse recovery, how to measure it, and the application to problems related to mental health and other areas. But there's still much work to be done. More work needs to be done to better validate the dimensions of recovery capital and understand how the dimensions interact in the recovery process. There's some evidence that there are gender differences in the development of recovery capital. And there needs to be more work in this area, as well as the work in special populations, such as adolescents. I think we have to understand have better understanding of its validation globally in different cultures. So I'm currently working with a team in Italy to assess if recovery capital can be used in the area of excessive social media use among young people. And also, how might recovery capital be used at a policy level? David Best, who I've mentioned a couple of times already, for instance, is examining ways that recovery capital can be used to create what he calls inclusive recovery cities that embrace recovery and reintegration. I'm also wondering, as I mentioned at the outset of this talk, about the role that generative AI may play in helping to cultivate and monitor one's recovery capital. So I think the future is exciting, largely because recovery capital is an inclusive concept, suggesting that we all have a role to play in helping to build communities that promote the capacity for people to overcome the problems and challenges that they will inevitably face. So I think I will stop here and thank you for listening. Let me stop sharing. Okay, Verna.
Thank you, Dr. Granfield, for such a very comprehensive presentation on the historical development of recovery capital. We do have a question from Warren. So Warren is interested to know if there is data on the levels of severity of your participants prior to their cessation of use since they did not receive treatment. Were you able to collect such information, sir?
We did collect such information. So we used the use of substances, or alcohol and illicit drug uses, uh, for a period of at least a year, and of experiencing problems. And in most cases, it was much more than that. But we wanted to really, where they wanted to make sure that individuals were seriously involved in heavy alcohol and drug use. Um, um, and as I said, we took an inventory of all the various alcohol drug related problems that they were experiencing. And they also had to be kind of in recovery for the same period of time, for at least a year. We didn't want individuals, a couple of weeks out. And again, most of them, the overwhelming majority were had more years in recovery. And we primarily looked at opioids. We looked at cocaine, and we looked at alcohol. So we were focused primarily, there were some individuals who talked about marijuana addiction. We excluded those individuals because we know the physiological aspects of addiction are very different. So we really also wanted to focus on the substances that contribute to physiological addiction, so as to, kind of make the population of users a little bit more narrowly defined.
So thank you very much. So there's like a stringent inclusion criteria when you guys did the initial study. Sir, you mentioned about the social structures and social interaction. I was wondering if you have observed any nuances between culture, different races in terms of how does this come into play in terms of recovery?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think we're seeing some. I think that one study that I have done on we kind of kind of in the area of diversity. I did a study back in 2017 with a graduate student, and we published it in I want to say it wasn't the Journal of Drug Issues. It'll come to me. But it was a study of faith-based communities. It was a study of individuals who they were formerly incarcerated individuals, and all of them were from an African-American background. And they were participating in a faith-based community within Buffalo. Now, the faith-based community was very important because it was in this community that, as I saw it, they were trying to build the aspects of recovery capital. Many of the individuals had spent several years in prison, in and out of prison. They came from backgrounds of poverty. A lot of instability in their lives. Many of them had not even had employment, really, legal employment for many years. So they had to learn, cultural values. They had to develop new networks. They had to develop skills and human capital. And it was really the faith-based communities, particularly in the absence of treatment programs and the absence of other resources, that these faith-based communities, I think, played a very important role. And I think related to the other question was that I think that I think the importance of severity is important, that some people have far more access to recovery capital than others. So that in cases such as the population that I was studying in 2017 of formerly incarcerated individuals, their recovery capital was to begin with was really low. It's very deficient. So I think it's important to think about that some individuals, in fact, Bill White made this point when he started working in this area back in around 2010, that it may help drive treatment decisions, or it may help to drive intervention decisions. Maybe there needs to be more building or different types of building of recovery capital for individuals who come from backgrounds of inequity, or come from backgrounds of disadvantage, because they haven't had the opportunity to develop recovery capital. The people that we studied had, in a sense, some of the foundations of recovery capital, because in part they had been able to lead fairly stable lives for at least a time in their life. Some of them had continued to work. For this population, as I mentioned, many had not had gainful employment and had spent, in and out of prison. So I think that severity question is a good one.
And I think I like what you also mentioned, that everyone has a turning point and it would be different for everyone.
Absolutely.
Guys, we still have time for one or two more questions. Feel free to use the chat box. And while we're waiting for that, so my other question, sir, is that so Recovery Capital has made significant contribution because of its holistic approach. If you were to choose one of your, I would say, favorite, or what do you think is the biggest contribution of Recovery Capital, like in your own opinion? So like, what would you like the most?
Well, I don't know. I think I can think of many things, but I think for me, as scientists, we often talk about the impact of our work, and oftentimes how that traditionally gets measured is, the impact on the literature or citation indexes or how many people cite your work, which is all very important. But personally, I think to have that kind of direct personal impact on people's lives that this concept has had, I think for me is the most meaningful impact that I can think about. The fact that it has had positive effects, helping people to move, from addiction and to kind of promote their well-being and greater satisfaction with life in general, to kind of live in a more harmonious life. I think for me, that's the greatest impact.
Thank you so much, sir. So it's like me, what I like about this is that we actually, like, from a perspective of a negative, like psychopathological, and then we're sort of moving to strength-based because there are resources other than ourselves that is readily available. There's another question with regards to 12-step group. He's asking for the participants in your study, but if I would add on to it, like, do you think that how does 12-step group comes into play with regards to the concept of recovery capital?
I'm sorry, Verna, could you rephrase that a little bit?
There's a question. This is a follow-up from Warren with regards to your participants attending the 12-step groups. But I think if we can expand it further to emphasize or to understand the role of 12-step groups in terms of recovery capital.
Thanks. I think it all matters. So this is the comprehensive nature of recovery-oriented systems of care that it includes various types of supports. I mean, I think that I do have concern, and as I have indicated previously, some of the research that we started was, the limitations that I see of the disease concept movement, because I think the disease concept movement places much of the burden on the individual, whereas I think the more kind of system approach that we're seeing develop with regards to recovery includes it all. It's the person, the personal, the social, the community, and all various aspects. So I think treatment does play a role. I think community groups play a role. I think self-help groups, 12-step groups play a role. But we have to understand that recovery is really an experience as opposed to simply an outcome. And so that experience, we're social and cultural beings. And so that experience is ongoing, and is never perhaps really over. I think sometimes when we focus on treatment, we focus on it as an outcome as opposed to a kind of a life journey, as it will.
Thank you, sir. And for our last question, you mentioned about the possibility of gender differences And David is asking if the recovery capital model has been tried on LGBT individuals with substance use problems.
I think exactly. I think this is what needs to be done. I think the more that we can understand how it applies to different populations, the nuances of it, maybe there may be certain dimensions of recovery capital that are more important in certain communities than in others. For instance, with young people, adolescents, you know, will human capital be as important like income? Well, lots of adolescents don't have income. They don't have the kind of human capital development that perhaps adults are able to develop. I mean, or the individuals in our study. So I think they're really challenged, but also opportunity to begin to think about how recovery capital can play out with various groups and various segments of culture, and to see how these things interact in a way that can facilitate positive recovery outcomes.
Thank you so much, sir. So, and with that, so I think that's a very good way to end our presentation with an opportunity and a challenge. Like for those in the academe who wants to explore further with regards to the work of recovery capital on different populations, and an encouragement, because I know that we have participants here who are actually working on the field from civil society, and partnership between civil society and the university would actually produce better results, because it's not all about the concept, but more so about the people. So, and with that, ICUDDR would like to thank Dr. Granfield for sharing his expertise. Let's give him a very warm round of applause. Thank you so much, sir. And to all of you for attending our webinar. So, our sincerest appreciation to everyone. To know more about our upcoming events, please follow our Facebook page at ICUDDR or visit our website at www.icuddr.com. So again, Dr. Granfield, thank you very much. It has been a very productive morning for us and evening to the rest of you. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.